Welcome to the Procurement Software Podcast, where we aim to educate and inspire you about how technology is changing and shaping our profession. The truth is, there's never been a more exciting time to be in procurement, but only if you're one of those organizations that's embracing the change and driving new developments. And this podcast is all about giving you the tools to help you get there. So buckle up and let's get right into this week's show. Yes, a very warm welcome to another episode of the Procurement Software Podcast. We are the official podcast of procurementsoftware.site. Is your go-to app to discover, learn about, and find all of the different procurement software solutions under the sun that you could possibly imagine. And we're especially strong in procurement software solutions that serve the mid-market, because that's typically the type of solutions that analyst firms and these enterprise level websites don't really cover. So that's really where we see our sweet spot. And in today's episode, I have a great guest for you. We're going to be talking about how to make SAP more intuitive. A lot of you, especially if you've been using SAP, probably can empathize and sympathize with this problem that great as a system that it may be, it's not particularly intuitive to the average user. And any procurement tech that we can put on the front end to make our lives easier and to can really get the most out of what is a complex and very comprehensive system, if you can get it to do what you want it to do, is most definitely welcome. So with that said, I'd like to welcome Shaun Syvertsen, who is CEO of ConvergentIS, to the podcast. Shaun, very warm welcome.
James, thanks so much for having me.
Shaun, before I ask you the initial icebreaker question, just give me a very quick elevator pitch of what ConvergentIS does in terms of its integration with SAP on the front end.
Yeah, I would even go so far as to say that our software solution doesn't integrate with SAP. It actually installs inside it. So it's a certified add-on that brings the latest and greatest user experience, even if you're still running a little bit of an older version of SAP or you haven't upgraded yet. And it helps level up your intake to procure. And I don't just say procure to pay, but intake to procure, because it's the intake and orchestration. And that's really where the game's at these days.
It is indeed, and everyone seems to be talking about it. So we'll dig into that in a little while. But first of all, I want to ask you the classic icebreaker that I do with all guests that come onto the show. And that is, you're a head of procurement and you've somehow managed to convince your CFO to give you a budget for procurement tech. You've got $50,000 to go and spend on a best of breed application. What type of tech would you go out and make your first investment in?
I love the question. I think the first thing that I would suggest is getting really, really clear on your strategy. And if that means that you need to go and pay a few experts for a little bit of advice, making sure that you're clear on your strategy and you know what's going to fit and what's not. And if you can go and get advice from folks like yourselves, and there's others out there that can help somebody identify the right technology after you've worked with the people to understand what's hard and understood what the strategy and process is to help make sure your spend is going to be going the right way deliberately instead of accidentally. And when I say deliberately instead of accidentally, I mean that because most people don't care about your procurement strategy. They care about doing their job. And if you want them to care, it's got to be so easy for them to do it the right way that they don't want to do it any other way. And so until you're clear on what that strategy is, and you can take all of those people that are perpetual novices at buying things the way that you want them to, if you throw some technology at them, you're probably looking at an adoption gap. And that's not what your CFO is going to want to see 6-12 months later. So be really, really clear. Are you solving the problem? And have you defined it correctly? And if you need to spend a little bit of money up front, really think it through to understand how you help those perpetual novices get it right the first time without extra training, because they don't have time for training. They just need it so easy to do it the right way that they feel like it's harder to do it wrong. And when you crack that nut, you got it.
Yeah, I love that. And I promise I didn't pay Shaun for that answer, because that's exactly what we talk about at procurementsoftware.site and what I talk about a lot on LinkedIn too, that you need to know your why before you go picking your what and your how. And if that means, as you quite rightly said, investing a little bit of time or maybe money up front and understanding what solutions are out there on the marketplace to solve some of your biggest pain points, that will be your navigation. That will guide you through understanding, okay, how can you best spend that budget? So yeah, I love that answer. Thank you. Alrighty. So intake and orchestration for SAP, or how do we make SAP more intuitive on the front end? So I'm going to kick this off with a premise, and that is that if you're selling into a company that is already running an SAP ERP system, whether that be ECC or S4HANA, or maybe they're even running Ariba with some of the bigger customers that you might come into contact with, they're unlikely to rip it out and go with a completely new system.
Exactly.
They're pretty much not going to take out an ERP system. It's just not going to happen. And if they're already running Ariba, the CFO or the CPO is probably not going to admit was sunk cost because they don't want to have egg on their face. So need to maybe start with a differentiation between those who are running SAP as a standalone ERP system versus who maybe have Ariba in place or perhaps Fieldglass or Concur if you look at across the whole SAP ecosystem. So who would you say is your ideal, if you could bake a gingerbread man of your ideal customer, who would it be in terms of where does it fill in the gaps?
Yeah, I think especially for the organizations that tune into this podcast, those, I'll call them the larger end of mid-market, right? They probably have the SAP ERP software and they needed to stop emailing their suppliers for POs and getting everything coming back by invoice. And what often happens is when they look at different ways of solving that, there's a lot of value in these concepts like a business network. Now, under the hood, the business network is really a fast, easy way of exchanging XML documents. And that's just a structured data set that's industry standard on what's in the PO and what's in the invoice, things like that. And so what that really starts to unlock for organizations is an easier path for onboarding. And if somebody doesn't have a connection into several business networks, as is often the case these days, then they really need to be making sure that they have their internal processes identified and designed in a way that makes it easy to collaborate more digitally. And so for the smaller mid-market organizations, what starts to happen is many of these organizations have made an investment in ERP. Maybe they've bought the ECC system or the S4 system. If they're on ECC, chances are they have plans to upgrade because moving off of it is, again, probably doubly expensive and significantly more disruptive for the business. So what we typically find is an organization that has found some ways of getting the most out of their ERP system, and they may or may not have purchased some procurement add-ons like the business network or Ariba, things like that. What we then find is making that so easy to use upfront to collect the intake and then orchestrating that across their ERP system. And what really differentiates here is when somebody's running SAP, they've already bought into a whole host of what are sometimes referred to as best practice processes. Now, tongue in cheek, what that really means is a group of engineers in Germany thought that these were good ideas some time ago and marketing got a hold of them and called them best practices. But that's okay because it creates some commonality in the way organizations work. And what we've found is even though there's multiple ways to set up and configure your SAP system, every time that I've seen something go that's designed and built completely separately, and you go and you try to integrate that with SAP, unless that other organization has significant experience integrating with those processes, business objects, data structure, all of those foundational elements, it gets very, very expensive to do the integration and do it well. And by doing it well, I mean it's primarily hands-off. Don't even have to touch it. what we often come across in solutions that were not built and designed for SAP is that the work to go and integrate them creates significant manual effort that erodes the value that they were originally conceived with or justified by. And that's, I think, the Achilles heel that's often overlooked. So what we typically see there is helping organizations make the most of the structure, the process that they've inherently designed their business around and that they've implemented in their business. And then make that so easy for their teams that they don't need training when they're adding a new step in a process. And critically, the orchestration of the request. So get the request in from somebody in the business that doesn't know or care about their process. Now execute that across SAP. Now, anytime somebody's talked about integrating with SAP and some eyebrows go up, that's really where we come in, right? Things that are designed and built for it and on it that install inside it instead of integrating with it are just smoother.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I touched on a couple of interesting points there that I'm just going to dig into a little bit more. So if you're a relatively small or lower end of the mid-market business, you could conceivably run procure to pay or intake to pay now as it's becoming outside of ERP and then just punch the data back in when you need to pay a vendor. If you've got a relatively non-complex operation and maybe only one or two sites and you're only running one ERP system, that's doable. But as you very correctly alluded to, orchestration is where the real value comes in. And once you get to a certain degree of complexity, intake is kind of obsolete with having some orchestration added on to further downstream.
Exactly.
So bearing that in mind then, Shaun, do you think that an existing SAP shop realistically consider running an agnostic best of breed intake and orchestration solution? Or would you say that those are generally going to find more traction in a more greenfield procurement scenario that doesn't have decades of legacy tech and an SAP system that's perhaps been in place for 15, 20 years?
What I've seen is, and this plays out when you go and you look at the success stories on the websites and you go and you talk to some people over a beer. Most of the newer intake and orchestration solutions are getting traction with the newer NetSuite implementations or the newer cloud ERP outside of SAP implementations, or perhaps some of the more software-centric Silicon Valley companies, right? These are companies that have much simpler supply chains. These are companies that don't have a decade or two of their supply chain data there and available, ready to be used, reused, and turned into some of those valuable insights that can then be surfaced to team members to help identify ideal supplier based on lead time, based on past performance, etc. And this, I think, separates the level of maturity in the established processes and data sets. Investments have been made over years and years in the ERP system that you've got. If you want to leverage that, we can look at organizations that were running SAP and they went and they picked, for instance, a large, call it a best of breed or one of the best of breed like a Coupa. But when you do this, you create so many different integration points through the intake to pay or procure to pay process. For instance, getting the hours for maintenance that you purchase back onto your work orders. It becomes a significant pain point. And then you need to go and make sure that the lead times are brought back in so your MRP can consider how long it takes things to get there. And now where are your goods receipts done? Are they done in your ERP or are they done in another suite? And then if you want to pay a vendor by evaluated receipt settlement, or you want to make sure your three-way matching is done flawlessly, how many different places do you have to look for the PO and for the goods receipt or the services receipt? And it starts to get messy very, very, very quickly. And this is really the strength of the integrated ERP. So when you want to take advantage of that, understanding that having an integrated ERP that is already passing the purchasing information back into finance, back into manufacturing, back into supply chain, back into all of the various other objects and business processes that are tied up, there are so many micro or key integration points through that intake to pay process. It can become an integration nightmare for a lot of organizations. And it's easy to glaze over that in the sales process when you look at some whiz-bang screens and you look at some cool demos. And it's very easy for organizations to go, oh, that's just an integration thing. IT will take care of that. That's fine. They'll deal with it. Sure, until you realize that your business case is shot because it now takes 3 people to go and manage and monitor the integration. That's death for your business case. And ultimately, you're putting your career on the line. And I think this is probably the most important part of recognizing and empathizing with the frustration that organizations have if they're running that SAP ERP and they're stuck in these transaction codes because they're still needing to go punch in purchase orders and go to, legacy transaction codes to do a goods receipt. If you don't have to do that and you have a modern mobile user experience, doesn't need to go and train people on how to use the system, you can alleviate that very quickly. And that's something you can do cost effectively. That's something that some organizations can even do for something not far from that price point, at least annually, that you mentioned earlier. So if you're looking to understand the contrast between the best of breed and an ERP investment that's already been made, for the procurement professional to stop and really consider all of the various touch points where data integration and data flow need to be done and managed flawlessly, that is where a lot of the business cases for some of the let's combine the best of breed starts to erode massively. So when we can take integration for the beast that it is and not minimize that, then you can leverage the value that you've already invested in. And I want to make sure that this isn't lost, because it's very easy for somebody in a line of business or a procurement function or a finance function to say, it's just integration. Again, it comes back to bite you. And if you're going to be there for a few years, especially in these organizations that are a few $100 million a year in turnover, you don't have the runway to make that sort of mistake. So working with instead of against some of the other teams to go and find those cost-effective solutions is going to be so important to making sure that you don't get caught with the integration boogeyman later on.
Just to expand a little bit on the whole conversation around configuration, getting it right during the design and implementation, let's take the complexity away from 1 minute and just talk to me a little bit about the setup, the configuration, how getting it right during that phase is actually going to increase user adoption.
I know it sounds simplistic, but it really comes down to people. And one of the risks with procurement professionals designing processes for non-procurement professionals is that we have a tendency of designing those for ourselves instead of designing those for people that are busy and they just need something to get on with their day. And if you're in procurement and you're designing something and you need 12 steps and 6 forms and 7 layers of approval, you're going to find very quickly that everybody and their brother is going to go around you. They will not comply unless there's somebody standing there with a stick. So if you think about water runs downhill, create that path and make it so easy for people to get what they need. And that's really where the intake and orchestration layer, and I know, one of the great minds in procurement technology recently described our solution as an overlay for SAP ERP for procurement, because it installs inside it and it can take that initial request and follow it all the way down through the various steps in needing to potentially run an RFP. And there's probably another system that does the request out to go and run the sourcing event. And that's okay. If there's not, that's fine. We can help a little bit with that. And then it goes through the selection. Then it gets through some final approvals. Then it gets through a contract. And then it gets through all of these other steps. And if you're in the business and you just needed something, guess what that feels like? Today, it probably feels like a giant black box. And they're frustrated because they're not sure what's happening next. And the procurement professional is too busy to go and handhold them through managing all of the expectations and telling them, here's the next 12 steps and here's why it's going to take 3 weeks to go and finish this thing. So when you can help somebody in the business see and understand that there's 17 things that all need to happen from the time that they need something to the time a sourcing event is run, the decision, the approval, the contract, and then finally the PO is done. And then they can place the order, or they can start receiving the services, or they can start receiving goods. That transparency is paramount. And making it so easy to ask for that in the first place, understand and see where the request is as it moves through. And if it gets stuck somewhere, making it super easy for them to go, hey, James, could you do this as a priority this morning for me because we need to rush this? But understanding that it's with you instead of with some unknown set of people that are behind a black curtain. We don't need a curtain for procurement. For procurement to show its value, it needs to be understood and transparent, all of the various things that need to happen. And there's compliance and audit and all the rest of that stuff that needs to be automated. When you understand those steps and you can easily drag and drop those steps into the series of events, and now you have how long that's typically taken because you've been doing it a while. And you can display and manage the expectations. So James, if you asked for a new supplier for, let's say, landscaping, you could understand that there's 17 steps that have to happen. And on average, that's going to take 3 weeks to run the sourcing event, pick it, etc. That helps manage your expectations. And you can see that people are working on it all the way through. And it doesn't feel like a black box. And that makes the difference in how your customers in procurement feel, because they no longer get frustrated with, these procurement guys take forever. I'm just going to go do it myself. They know, they see it's happening. They see it's happening the right way. And it's easier for them to do it that way. And then if you order something off of Amazon, you see that it's getting shipped. Later today, I've got a package coming in from UPS. I know what time window it's coming in, and it's not just 9 to 5 anymore. So that's the before and the after. The before was, I don't know how to buy something. I'm just going to go try to do it myself. And then I'll tell procurement, I've already picked the vendor and I've already negotiated the terms. Go make it happen. As opposed to, hey, James, we need a new landscaping vendor. Can you help me out? Then you can ask several other questions to help you get the context that you need right now. Then you can go find them, bring them back, onboard them, etc., and take care of all of those other steps. And that's the difference between a frustrated business community that doesn't get what you do and something that feels really smooth to them. And then you become the internal Amazon for them when they need something.
Or you don't, and they go and harangue the person that's actually responsible if it's accounts payable that's that they need to go and speak to in that sense. Sorry, I'm just playing devil's advocate. So that part's clear. So other than P2P, talk to me a little bit about how an orchestration solution can deliver value beyond that when you have an incumbent SAP system, or perhaps even a legacy procurement suite, let's say Ariba, or maybe even a non-SAP procurement suite, I don't know, Cooper or Jagger or something like that.
Yeah, what we often find is companies that are running ERP, they have nothing, right? They might even have DocuSign if they're lucky. I think there's often a sense of looking out, and this is a bit of the social media effect, that everybody else is more mature than me and they've all got a superior tech stack and they're all way more automated than I am. And the reality that we keep finding is that there's organizations that are out there just discovering that something called intake and orchestration exists. So the ERP system is already running the backbone of the procure to pay. There's probably an MRP system that's in there running if you're in manufacturing. And that's okay. When you overlay an Ariba in that mid-market space, it's often cost prohibitive to go and get and afford the full suite and the full capability for direct, as an example, that Ariba has. So you then need to pick and choose, how do I get the most out of what I've got? And at that point, the full suite is often too expensive. So if you can't afford $3 million a year for the software and another 5 to 10 to implement it, and I think it's safe to say most of the audience for your podcast is not expecting that as the budget that they would have approved. That might be the budget.
I think that's a fairly safe assumption. Yeah.
Right. That probably exceeds the budget for the ERP, let alone the procurement suite. So how do you go and look at, selfishly, we have the number one add-on for a reason. How do you go and get more out of the ERP system you've already invested in? And if you've already made some investment in the business network, as an example, how do you piggyback on that to layer on more if you can't afford the license and implementation for the full suite, right? And that's where there's add-ons like ours, and there's some others out there that honor the data structure and foundation of the ERP system that is the center of your operating system for your business, and then collaborate better with vendors, complement what's already there from SAP, and add to that. Either it's field tickets for energy, or it's AI invoice automation, or it's that intake and orchestration, so your business has their expectations managed, and the policy and process and vendor selection and so on is category management is actually set up. And when you do that well, it means that for the data cleanliness starts to improve further just by reinforcing getting the information in there right the first time, helping people ask for the right thing the right way. So from the premise of the question, I think there's the idea that Jagger is going to work really, really well with an SAP ERP. Maybe sometimes you start to erode the value of the integrated ERP. And you start to run into challenges like, well, hey, if I'm buying the services, how do I get the services back onto the work order when I have somebody doing it? Or if I am going to run the goods receipt, then I still need to go figure out how I integrate the goods receipt back so that I can do the three-way matching properly. Otherwise, you start to three-way match in a totally different system, and some of the other supply chain logistics and MRP analytics that the ERP system needs to do start to erode too. So distributing things across too many systems is a really quick way to create what the CFOs are also looking at is SaaS sprawl. And if you want some sarsaparilla, then just keep drinking up all of the various sales pitches from lots of different SaaS things. I know my wife and I looked at our Visa statement and we're kind of horrified to realize how many little tiny subscriptions for little apps we'd collected over a year or two since we'd last really sat down to look at it. And you can kind of go, oh yeah, there's Trailforks and there's the trail map, and then there's All Trails, and there's obviously we have some outdoorsy kind of pursuits here, but when you stack all of these things up along with Zwift and some other things, it's like, well, it's summertime. I'm not riding indoors. I'm riding outdoors. So maybe we don't need Zwift over the summer. So if you're working for the CFO and you are in charge of procurement, you are also playing a key role as a guardian of preventing SaaS sprawl and making sure that you are getting more out of the investments that you've already made. So I think that's really one of the most important questions that you can help ask, because strategically, creating more SaaS sprawl when you've already invested in solutions that do a significant portion of what you need, it's really hard to justify.
Yeah, I was probably going back about a year, but I was speaking to a contact of mine, and he just started a new job as an interim manager at big FTSE 100 publicly listed company in the UK. And he was saying they were running Ariba for P2P, and then they were running Jagger for sourcing and source to contracts. I think, well, why do you need both of them? They kind of both do the same. So yeah, you're absolutely right that these things can become like multi-headed monsters over the years when you have different people with different agendas and different thoughts and strategies coming into an organization. If the CFO doesn't take a critical look at it and challenge some of it, you're absolutely right. Yeah. The last thing that I wanted to ask you around this was everyone is claiming now that they have AI in their products, and it's becoming a bit of a cliche and a bit of a buzzword. And to your credit, I had a good look at your website before we came on air, and you haven't got it plastered all over your website. But I'm curious to ask you, what can AI do that the incumbent technology can't do if we look at it specifically with intake and process orchestration in mind?
I love the question, and thanks. Appreciate that. I know AI is a technology. It's not an outcome. And so as much as we have artificial intelligence and machine learning and generative AI in our software, we've deployed it a little bit differently than I think some of the other organizations out there. And I'll share the basic premise. And that is the cost of the software is one thing, but in an enterprise, it's often the cost of the implementation that's tricky. And what often happens is, here's a $2 million software solution. It's going to cost $6 million to implement. And the challenge that I gave to our team, our design and product and engineering teams, was what would need to be true for an organization to be able to take our intake and orchestration solution and we call it our procurement gateway. It's on SAP has a store, a marketplace of sorts. You can't actually transact on it, but it's a lovely catalog. It's our solution's promoted there, but you can take that solution and you can deploy that into your organization in weeks. And we've done that in taking advantage of, number one, honoring the configuration and the structure and so on that somebody already has in their ERP system. So the fundamental underlying structure is something you've already invested in. You've already implemented the SAP ERP system. You're probably already sending out POs, and you're probably already doing goods and services receipts, and you're probably already processing invoices. So that doesn't need, what part of what's unique about our solution is that doesn't need to be set up again. It's already there. Now let's honor that. So that's function number one of how to minimize the cost of deployment and make sure that you don't have to reconfigure and configure an extra set of purchase order documents and an extra set of purchase order POs, PDF templates, and things like this. Now, once you get past that, you get into the AI capability to take your policies, your forms, your email templates, and now quickly convert that into some of the intake wizards. Now, add on top of that the ability to use generative AI. Yes, I try not to throw that term around too much, but it is pretty remarkable what you can do with it. To go and process the easy invoices and the hard invoices, and even some of the account statements, and even some of the contracts that are sent in with new rates, so that people don't have to re-enter those. This becomes both a combination of the implementation effort to take the policies, processes, and forms and so on that you've got today, plus the documents that you're exchanging manually and by email with a bunch of your business partners, suppliers and vendors and so on, and automate that. And when you can combine that, you now have the capability to go from where you are today to live in weeks, not years. And I think it's often unfortunate that SAP has a reputation of everything is 2 years and $10 million. And that's really not the case, because we've got lots of live customers with our solution that went live in projects, implementation projects measured in weeks. Our record, by the way, was 3 weeks to get somebody from kickoff to productive for their first vendors. And so when we can do that in a few weeks, and granted that we had like all the stops taken out for us because we were on a very, very short timeline before a significant upgrade started. So we can't always do 3 weeks. However, that's a huge contrast between we're going to design and think this blueprint for 4 months before we actually go and configure anything. Because I don't think anyone has patience for that, James. And that to me is the premise of where AI comes in, is reduce the time from the time that somebody says go until the time that you actually start realizing value from it. So in software, or from an investment perspective, you can call it TTV, time to value. And when AI can help you reduce your TTV, that helps your business case. Because that implementation in your first year is often that hurdle that's very difficult to get past.
Yeah, no, I completely get that. And if it's a 3-year contract and you're not seeing ROI on that until well into year 2, then it has a massive impact on your business case, on your overall numbers, doesn't it? So yeah, completely understand where you're coming from there.
Yeah.
Just conscious of the time, Shaun, and need to wrap this up. So going to go now to the quick fire round. So first question is, don't look that nervous. First question is, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would be your dream destination? Where would you choose?
Oh, that's easy. I already lived there. That's in Calgary, Alberta, in Canada. It was ranked the 5th best city in the world to live in, and I love it here. We've got Banff and Lake Louise and Kananaskis in the mountains, just right out our doorstep, just a few hours away. Some of the world's best skiing, mountain biking, hiking. Yes, we have bears. They are best if left be. Don't try to feed them or pet them. They're not. Yeah, they might be cute, but don't try to pet them. We see tourists do that. It's just a bad idea. I'm also real fond of Fernie, British Columbia as well. Great ski hill mountain biking down there.
Yeah, I live in the mountains during summer and I'm a big hiker too. So yeah, completely get that. There are not many bears where I am, thankfully, but yeah. And then final one, what is your favorite guilty pleasure? And please keep it clean.
Oh, I have this thing with chocolate mousse, James, and tiramisu are two of my favorite desserts. And I know there's espresso and caffeine in tiramisu, and life is best. My sleep is best when I only have that as a lunchtime dessert. But if it's on the menu and it's dinner time, I'll tell you, if it's a really good Italian restaurant and there's some good tiramisu on there, okay, that's it. I'm up until 2. Here we go.
Got it. Okay. So Calgary and tiramisu. Got it. So last thing before we sign off, Shaun, if anyone's listening to this and would like to learn a little bit more about you and your solution, ConvergentIS, where should we send them?
I am pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. I am all about that never-ending climb to leave things better than they were before. And that's both personally, professionally, all around. I believe deeply in that. So you can search for never-ending climb. I'm pretty easy to find that way. If you want to search for Shaun Syvertsen, I know sometimes spelling is tricky, but if you search for ConvergentIS.com, pretty easy to find there.
And we'll link to all of that in the show notes if you're listening in one of the major podcast players. Shaun, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us. And really great answers there in terms of getting the ROI on your existing ERP system without having to invest a fortune into additional applications or software. Thanks very much. And all the best.
James, much gratitude. Thank you.
Okay, that was Shaun from ConvergentIS. Just a quick one before we sign off. It's great having you with us here on this journey and listening to the podcast. But please, if you can, just take a few seconds to leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or to follow us on Spotify so as we can hopefully float to the top of the searches for procurement podcasts. There are a lot of them out there. We actually did a blog post a couple of months ago with 50 of the top procurement podcasts. So we have some competition. Some of them are great. Happy to share the platform with them. But if you could help us to float to the top, I would certainly appreciate it. Until then, we'll be back same time next week. Take care wherever you are in the world, and bye for now.